And I wanted to end this message on Hebrews chapter 3 because the author talks about encouragement. And that sounds so generic, but I want to consider with you, what does Christian gospel encouragement mean? And how can you apply this to your life? Are you a good encourager? Do people encourage you? Do you feel encouraged? How would you even define encourage as opposed to discourage? What are the definitions of that? How do you understand this? And I'm going to consider this with you because if you know anything about the letter of Hebrews, it was written to second generation Jewish Christians. And if you can imagine a Jewish person becoming Christian and giving his life to Jesus, they were suffering a level of persecution. There was political and economic persecution. They were losing their houses. And if you were back then the original reader of this letter, there would be a temptation for you to give up Christianity. Haven't seen Jesus, haven't touched him, figuring this out, you're a young believer, and all of a sudden in your life you're losing everything. There's a temptation to say, forget this. It's not worth it. I'm just going to go back to my old way of life. And so then the author writes this letter to encourage them to persevere. And we don't know a lot about the author. We don't know his name, but we know at least two characteristics of his heart. One, you see that he's a pastor because over and over again within this letter, he peppers and disperses and scatters throughout the letter various pastoral warnings to tell them, don't give up the faith. Don't give up the faith. Hold on to the faith. And he gives warning after warning to say, don't fall back to your old ways because that's a life that is not as vibrant, but hold on to Jesus Christ so you can live a life that's anew. The other thing we see about this author is not that he's just a pastor, but he's a theologian. And as a theologian, he's trying to show these readers the beauty and the glory of Jesus because his logic is, if they can see the glory and the splendor, the majesty of all that Jesus Christ is and what he has done, why would they ever consider giving up Christianity and going back to their old ways of life? That's why in the letter, if you read this, he's always doing a comparison. He says, isn't Jesus a better prophet than Moses? Isn't Jesus better than the angels? God used to speak through the prophets of the Old Testament, but he spoke finally in his son Jesus Christ. There's the old covenant in the Old Testament, but Jesus is the mediator of a new and better covenant. There always is a contrast to say Jesus is supreme. And then in this letter, he's saying, don't give up Christ because of all the beauty that you can experience. And he's basically making the point that if you want to get through life, there is one absolutely necessary spiritual discipline that you're going to learn how to apply in order to make it in life. And this applies for you and me. I don't know if all of you are college students, there's pressure there. You got to pick your major, you got to study well, you have to have relational commitment, figuring out your friends, discerning whether or not you're going to marry someone, date someone, figure out your next stage of life. Am I going to grad school? Am I going to stay here? How do I balance all my aspirations in my career with the commitments that I should have with church? How do I understand all this? And there could be a risk for you to go back to your old ways of life and say, it's so much easier if I didn't have to do this Christian thing. And the writer here in Hebrews is speaking to you and say, don't give up. And there's one radically important spiritual discipline for you to make it through. And he says it right there in verse 13, encouragement. And so I want to consider with you three aspects of encouragement here today so that you can learn how to apply it so you can make it in life as well to a better, more fulfilling life. First, we're going to look at, when it comes to encouragement, why do you and I need this? Secondly, what is encouragement? How do I define it? And then third, who's really called to apply gospel encouragement? Is it just Pastor Paul? Is it potentially future elders and deacons? Who's called to do this encouragement? So one, why do we all need it? Secondly, what is it? And then third, who's called to do this? So let's look at this quickly. First, why do we need this? Well, we know we need it because in verse 12, there's a sense of urgency here. The author is writing to people who are being persecuted, and he says there, take care, brothers. Literally, that verb means to see. So the author is saying, look, be careful, watch out. You're in danger of falling away from a better spiritual life. It's basically a warning. Remember, the author is a pastor. So we get a sense of urgency here. The author is saying, you need to hear what I'm about to tell you this morning because it's a life and death situation. If you don't hear this, then you risk falling away from God in verse 12, or you risk being hardened by the deceitfulness of your sin, verse 13. And he says this, in verse 13, or in this passage, the author is essentially quoting from Psalm 95, where Psalm 95 is talking about Israel's wilderness wandering. Now, if you didn't grow up in the church and Christianity is new, or maybe you're here and you're exploring Christianity, the Israel's wilderness wandering is one of the most famous stories of Christianity. It's about the people of God, the Israelites, who were under the captivity of the Egyptians, and they wanted to be freed, so they cry out to God. God sends them this guy, Moses, who's played by this guy, Charlton Heston, in this iconic movie of the Ten Commandments. He's the one that comes down from Mount Sinai. Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. They cross the parting of the Red Sea. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years, which is essentially a time of testing before they can enter the promised land, the land of Canaan, which is, by the way, in our contemporary vernacular where we get this idea, there's the promised land. It's completely biblical. Canaan was their prototype of heaven. Wander, suffer, struggle, persevere, 40 years in the wilderness so you can enter the promised land. That's what the author of Hebrews is taking Psalm 95 in this wilderness wandering from the Old Testament thousands of years ago and applying it to the second generation Hebrews, the Jewish converts, and saying theologically, you are also in your wilderness wandering. You're being tested. You're being persecuted. And how are you going to get through this? That's what the author is doing. That's why we need encouragement, because you can only get through your wilderness wandering with one another and encouraging each other. Friends, when you think about wilderness, you're probably thinking about a jungle or you're thinking about woods. But in the Bible, wilderness is more often than not like a desert. It's dry, you're parched, you're struggling, you're sweaty, you're tired, and it really conveys this idea that you're in a period of testing. And theologically, the book of Hebrews is saying this. The Israelites were in their wilderness wandering, back in Numbers, in Exodus. The Jewish second generation converts in Hebrews were in their wilderness wandering, persevering through persecution. And he's saying for us here today, if you follow Jesus Christ, you are also in your desert. You are also in the wilderness wandering. As Billy Graham says, heaven is your home, and we're passing along through this place, which means right now in your metaphorical, theological desert, you are being tested, you're pressured. There are idolatries that are vying for the affections of your heart. There's temptations to give up Jesus and go back to your old ways of life. You're being tested in some ways. You may not be persecuted. You're not losing your homes. Your lives are not being threatened, but you are in your wilderness wandering because you live on this side of glory before Jesus comes back. And the only way that you're going to get through the deserts of your life is by encouraging one another. Now, I'm not advocating listening to this heavy metal band that I used to listen to when I was in middle school, but there was a band that I used to listen to called Guns N' Roses. And one of their most famous songs that was a hit was a song called Welcome to the Jungle. Now, if you know a little bit about that song, Welcome to the Jungle wasn't talking about a wilderness or a desert. It was talking about Los Angeles, an urbanite jungle. Because as the article went to say, the band and Axl Rose were pursuing fame in the beginning, but they're saying there's such a dark side of the city where you're trying to survive, and all these powerful realities are vying for the affections of their hearts. They're literally in the jungle. Even non-Christians, even Axl Rose knows that they live in a period of testing. That's the world that we live in. So whether you're in suburbia, whether you're in college, whether you graduated in grad school, whether you're starting out through engagement in marriage, we are theologically, metaphorically also in the jungle because we live on the dark side of this glory, where the world is riddled with sin and is broken, and there are so many things that are vying for the affections of your heart. The question isn't this, friends, is if you have potential idols. The question is, what is your idol? Be introspective, let the Spirit speak. Do you idolize success and grades? Do you envision yourself being powerful, rich, moving up the corporate ladder, having a prestigious job, all things which are good in themselves? But as one pastor said, our hearts are idol factories, as Calvin says, and so we take good things, we make it a God thing, and therefore it becomes a bad thing. What are the affections of your heart? What are the temptations that you have? Is it relationships? Is it sex? Is it money? All of you have some sort of counterfeit God and idol. The question is, what is it? Because that will be the specific expression of the desert that you're living in, the jungle that you're struggling with. Living life in the jungle, in the desert, can lead us to a bitter, frustrated, broken, and critical life. And there are so many realities that are vying and competing for the affections of your heart. And the author here is saying, don't fall into that deceit. The world, as good as it is, will never compare to the surpassing glory of Jesus Christ. That's why the author said Jesus is better than Moses. Jesus is better than the angels. Have you seen an angel? Have you ever experienced and seen the angel? Maybe precious moments at the Hallmark store, but you don't see an angel. Jesus is even better than the angel. He's better than money. He's better than power. He's better actually than relationships, which, by the way, means that you don't falsely dichotomize and saying these are sort of secular bad things and Jesus is better. Actually, the idea is that not that you love power more than Jesus, but actually that you understand how the gospel allows you to use power. In other words, don't love money and use people to get money. Don't love power and use people to get power, but use power to love people. Use money to serve people. The concept of idolatry is interesting because it basically means that we use people and things in order to satisfy ourselves. We use people and money and power to satisfy our selfish ambitions. But God says, love Him and love people and use things. And we always flip that upside down on its head. And the only way that you're going to be able to get through this is according to verse 13, exhort one another daily. Exhort. That word also is translated as encouragement. So this leads us to our second point. What is encouragement? If encouragement is the only way that you're going to get through this, no, money is really good. Sex is really good. Jesus talks about money and sex more than He does heaven. Those things are really good. Education is really good. Friendship's really good. Comfort's really good. They're just never meant or designed to satisfy the depths of your heart. So what exactly is encouragement here? That word there in the Greek is this word parakaleo. And it's a compound word that basically means this. Kaleo means to call or summon. And as we look at this, that part of the word is something that's more intellectual and cognitive. Call and summon, truth and doctrine. Tell someone this is bad, this is sin. Kaleo is to call. Para means to come alongside someone, to be alongside, to the side, or to one side. It's where we get our English word paramedic. They come alongside the medical professionals. Or paralegal. They come alongside the lawyers. So this word parakaleo on the one hand means call and summon, but also para, which means you walk alongside people. That's essentially what encouragement is. There's a tension here because there's a wide range of meanings. In the New Testament Hellenistic world, the general sense of this word parakaleo is exhortation, encouragement, or asking. It's more cognitive. In the Old Testament use of this word, it carries a sense of comfort, of pity, of compassion. It reflects this idea that you're so empathetic for someone's hurt that it conveys an idea of, I'm so sorry that you have to go through this. You breathe deeply in compassion and empathy. The physical expression of sorrow is very emotive. That's how the word is used in the Old Testament. So in the New Testament Hellenistic world, it's exhortation, asking, it's truth. On the Old Testament use, it's a empathetic, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you have to go through this. And so there's a tension here. And this is what it means, and this is what it looks like. If you want to grow, and if you want to be anew, if you want to make it through life so that you don't fall to the deceitfulness of sin and ruin and crush your life by your very own sin, you need to surround yourself by people who can parakaleo you. You need people who love you enough to give you truth and say, hey, I think that actually is not biblical. That is sinful. I care about the holiness of God. You need people who love you enough to take the gloves off to let you know you're living in sin. On the other hand, you also have to surround yourself by people who will walk alongside of you in the moments that you're hurting. The people who can, I'm so sorry that you're going through such a tough time. So you need to surround yourself with people who can embrace this tension, know how to encourage biblically, because that's the only way that you're going to get through life. But it also means this for you. You yourself need to embrace this tension so that you can encourage someone else in this church. That's why for those of you who became members, you have become members of HCM. You have to embody the gospel ability and spiritual discipline to parakaleo the people here at HCM because they have become your family. You have to understand how to be lovingly brave to speak truth into someone's life, but compassionately deep so you could walk along somebody's life. You have to be able to know God's truth and gently and winsomely speak God's truth into each other's lives, but also experience the Spirit so that you're compassionate so that you can breathe along certain people's life, walk alongside of them. If you want to be an encourager, you have to embody this tension in encouragement, exhortation, parakaleo. Many of us, in our own ways, are so insecure, especially when it comes to relationships and community, and that insecurity makes us self-focused, absorbed within ourselves, self-concentrated, so that we're easily agitated and fearful. We're so worried about what people think, and we always fall victim to some version of fear of man. This insecurity, this fear of man, destroys your ability to parakaleo. And friends, this is the truth. Some of you are really good at the para. You're so empathetic. You are so compassionate, and your heart breaks. It's a bleeding heart for any small or big moment of suffering in somebody's life. You are really good at that. Others of you, you're really good at telling people when they're wrong. You're critical. You're self-righteous. You love to pinpoint when people are broken, are sinful, are messing things up in their lives. You sort of sway to one side or the other. It's rare when somebody's able to embody and to embrace this tension perfectly. You either are para or you are either kaleo. You love criticizing and all about doctrine and truth and you criticize people, or you're so compassionate and you're saying, I'm so sorry that you're going through this. Let me help you out. Do you need a lunch? Do you need somebody to pray for you? Do you want to meet at a coffee shop and talk about this? You are so good at this. But if you really want to encourage each other biblically, gospel-centeredly, you have to be able to embrace this tension and learn how to be both para and kaleo. There's a tension here. That's something that you have to embrace in your life. To know God's truth deeply, to love God's people deeply, so you take that truth to them, but also to understand the brokenness in the world of suffering so that you can be compassionate. To be a good encourager, you can't just be the nurse who always bandages up the wounds, but you also can't be the drill sergeant who always loves telling people what to do. Friends, you have to discover how you are and the way that you are bent. Most of you probably know, you resonate with this. Yeah, I'm sort of the one who just kind of breathes deeply and feels compassionate, but at the same time, you know you're a little bit cowardly, and you actually don't love people enough because you never want to speak truth. Others of you are sort of like the contemporary Pharisee. You love the law, you love doctrine, you love telling people what to do, you're critical. You know you're like this. If you don't know who you are or where you sort of lean towards, there's a very simple application to discover where you lean. Take 2 or 3 people that you are close with and that you hang out with a lot and just simply ask them, am I somebody who's empathetic, or I'm somebody who always tells you and loves to correct you and talk about truth? Figure out where you are so that you can understand where you need to grow. You can't just be an enabler, but you also just can't be a defeater. You can't pretend everything is okay all the time, but you also can't tell people everything is wrong all the time. You have to be both. You have to know both. You need this balance. And the only person who gets this balance perfectly and has the wisdom to apply this perfectly is a guy named Jesus. He's the only one that gets it right because he's the perfect sinless man. He walks alongside the marginalized of the world, the Good Samaritan. He walks along the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. He always walks alongside the prostitutes and the unclean, the demon-possessed, the woman bleeding for 12 years. He's compassionate, so he goes to the little girl, Jairus' daughter, to raise her, Talitha Kumi. He walks alongside the people that are marginalized by society. That's why he eats with tax collectors. At the same time, He is the embodiment of truth. He's the direct revelation of God according to John 1. He is the final consummate and exact imprint of who God is in his revelation, Hebrews chapter 1. So he's always telling the Pharisees that they're legalistic. He's strong with their words, and he says, you brood of vipers. At the same time with the disciples, he was patient, leading them, walking with them, talking with them, showing them miracles, giving them a private lesson. He walks alongside the disciples, but he's also strong enough to kaleo them, because he even says to Peter, who is supposed to be his inside circle, Satan, get behind me. He has no problem speaking loving truth to various people, the Pharisees, but also his inside circle. He also has no problem walking alongside people in compassion. He was the one who cried when Lazarus was dead, but he's also the one who holds doctrine perfectly within himself. In other words, friends, if we generalize, a bit anachronistic, in some ways they say the conservative people, the Republicans, not to politicize this, but Republicans and conservatives are all about doctrine. They dot their I's, they cross their T's. They're all about type A people and having everything fit into a nice moralistic box. They're all about personal responsibility and morality. They're all about telling people what they're wrong to do. Progressives, liberals, quote-unquote Democrats, are all about changing systems. They're compassionate. They're about social justice. They want to do things so that they can help people because their heart breaks for the marginalized and the oppressed and the minority group. Jesus shows us an encouragement that he doesn't fit in either ideology. He's not conservative and he's not Republican. He is not actually democratic and liberal. He's actually more conservative than the conservative because he dots his I's and he cares about holiness. He cares about personal responsibility. He cares about sin. But he's also more liberal than the liberal because his heart breaks, is compassionate, perfectly, more so than anybody else in this world. He eats with the tax collectors. He walks with the ceremonially unclean. He walks with those women who've been bleeding for 12 years. He always engages in fellowships with the people that are on the low social caste system within the particular culture that he's engaged in. That's Jesus Christ, the only one to embody this truth. And if you look to Jesus, you will grow and be able to learn how to do this for yourself. And this leads us to our last point. Who's called to do this? To encourage one another? Is it Pastor Paul? Is it the seminary students? Is it your family group ministry leaders? Who is this? Well, verse 13 gives us the answer. It says there, but exhort one another every day. One another. Not each other, but one another. Emphasizes this mutual responsibility to do it. We all know that relationships are hard and tough, but this exhortation, this commandment in verse 13 is given to you and me. That means if you're walking with Jesus for 20 years, you're still called to exhort one another. And if you just became Christian and given your life to Jesus, you're called to exhort and encourage one another. Everyone has to do this. So I want to end this sermon on some practical applications about how to do this with each other. And I want to bring clarity to know how your relationships are. I'm taking this from a book written by two guys, Tim Lane and Paul Tripp. They wrote a book called Relationships, A Mess Worth Making. And they basically said, when it comes to relationships, there's always a tension. Because being made in the image of God, we naturally desire to have deep community. We want to be vulnerable, we want to be fully known, but we also want to know people. But because of sin, we always hide ourselves, especially in Asian-based culture. We're all shame-based. So we hide ourselves so that there's a tension to want to be vulnerable and know and be known, but we hide ourselves so we put up a facade, our Sunday best, and we hide the skeletons in our closets. We cover up our fears and anxieties. We don't want to share this with people because they may not like us or they reject us. So there's a tension in relationships. And he says basically this in the book. You tend towards either being an isolationist, which means that you're a lone ranger. You think to yourself, I can live life by myself. People are a headache that's not worth making, a mess worth making. People are not worth investing in. They just bring more sin and hurt to me. So you're an isolationist. Or the other type of person is that you're an immersionist. You immerse yourself in relationships. And people tend to think immersionists are actually extroverts and isolationists are actually introverts, which is a general conception but not always true. But in other words, isolationists are independent. Immersionists are codependent. Isolationists make too little of relationship. Immersionists make too much of relationships. Isolationists devalue relationships and people. Immersionists overvalue relationships. And so if you're an isolationist or immersionist, this is how your relationships could be. And they say there's basically 3 types of relationships. There's first a frustrated relationship when you have an isolationist and immersionist together. I see this in marriage, I see this in best friends, I see this among siblings. Someone who wants to be by himself and someone who needs people. One person dreams of being safe, the isolationist. The other dreams of being intimate. The isolationist always feels smothered because he needs his personal space. The immersionist always feels rejected because they keep coming back. Let's have deep, meaningful conversations. Let's talk a lot. I need to be known. I want to share my feelings and my heart. Both feel constantly frustrated, and the relationship is always disappointing. Secondly, there's an enmeshed relationship. You're enmeshed in one another. This is when you put an immersionist together. They ride the roller coaster of each other's emotions. They're dependent upon each other. They're codependent. They idolize each other in attention. Their expectations are so transcendently high, they tend to isolate themselves from other people, and it requires a lot of work. It's exhausting because you can never fill the void when they place godlike expectations upon one another. They never meet each other's expectations, so it's also disappointing. Usually this happens oftentimes when a couple first gets together and they idolize love and relationships and romance, and they're just spending 24/7 with each other, and they slowly move away from the community of God's people or any community. Usually that's the telltale sign that there's an enmeshed relationship that's not the most biblical. God blesses you with relationships so that you could use your relationship to bless the community. The third relationship that they talk about is an isolated relationship. This is when you have an isolationist and isolationist. Both move towards independence. Conversations are safe and surface level, they're limited, they're very impersonal. They long for safety, actually, and they are independent, but being human, they still innately in their hearts want community, but they're so insecure they protect themselves, so the relationship moves further and further apart. The most detrimental example of this sort of isolated relationship is when it's between a husband and a wife. And a close second, I believe, is between parent and child. The problem with all 3 of these relationships is that they're self-centered, self-absorbed. They make too much or too little of relationships. And the question is, what does God intend for your relationships? How to be other-centered, how to be missional, how to be loving. Verse 13 says this, "But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of your sin." Friends, I know it's hard to have a relationship where you can encourage one another, especially if you're on the receiving end. We often think, what gives that person a right to speak into my life? You don't know me, don't judge me, you don't have a relationship with me, don't tell me I'm sinning, you can't make an assessment on me. Tim Keller has said this, there's only one qualification that allows somebody else in this church to be able to speak loving truth in your life and walk alongside of you. There's only one qualification for someone to have to speak truth into your life. And that one qualification is that they are not you. That's all you need. Because in your spiritual walk, we all have blind spots in our spirituality. If you're driving, you have a blind spot, so when you change lanes, you got to look back and check your blind spot. Unless you have a Tesla or a car that kind of checks your blind spot for you, just move straight over. But we all have spiritual blind spots. You don't realize that sin has clouded your understanding and self-awareness, that you have blind spots. You don't realize that you talk abrasively. You don't realize that you idolize grades and success and money and power. You don't realize the potential idols that are vying for the affections of your heart as you wander and struggle through the desert and wilderness wandering of your life. You don't know this. The only way that you can come to crystal clarity is if there are people around you that can parakaleo you, because the way to check your blind spot is going to be through the spiritual eyes of people in your community who love you. So when you take yourself out of that community and people who want to parakaleo, just realize it's like driving on the highway with really big spiritual blind spots in your walk and race for Jesus Christ. Who wants to drive with spiritual blind spots? And if you don't have encouragement, if you don't have parakaleo in community, a deep, vital, other-centered relationship, it's essentially driving like on the Autobahn in the middle of the night with your headlights turned off. Who would ever do that? You're destined for destruction. That's why the author in verse 13 says, encourage one another so that you don't fall into the deceitfulness of sin. That's his antidote. What prevents you from falling into the deceitfulness of your sin? Well, yes, you got to read the Bible, you got to worship, you got to serve, and you got to pray, you got to repent. But it says there very practically, the way that you're going to not fall in the deceitfulness of your sin will be by encouraging one another. So that to the degree that you learn yourself and immerse yourself in a community that's other-centered and gospel-centered, that they can encourage one another will be to the degree that you will not be deceived by sin. You'll have clarity of life. Everything will cohere. You'll have what the Old Testament calls shalom, a coherence, a calmness, bringing chaos into order. And you need one another in order to do this. Friends, this is where you ultimately get the power to do this. In order to have other-centered, encouraging relationships, there is somebody who is the perfect encourager who had a shattered relationship. And his name is Jesus Christ. Jesus was shattered in his relationship on the cross. He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? God, Dad, why did you do this to me? And his dad turned away and poured out his wrath upon his very own perfect son for your sin and mine. So that Jesus immersed himself in your sin, and he was isolated on the cross so that you could have the power in the gospel to immerse yourself in a loving way for the sake of each other. Did you know, in fact, that Jesus was able to do what you couldn't do, not just because he had the perfect balance of para and kaleo, but that he was a perfect person who was able to succeed when all of humanity failed? The Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus knows all about wilderness wandering because in Matthew chapter 4, before he began his earthly ministry, God decided that he had to be tested. So Satan brought him into the wilderness for 40 days. 40 years, 40 days. Without getting into the details, commentators will note that Jesus was tested for 40 days in the wilderness by Satan. 3 tests that were essentially the same 3 tests that the Israelites went through for 40 years in the wilderness. But the Israelites failed all 3 tests and showed that Jesus was the true Israelite that was able to do what the Israelites couldn't do because he was tested the same 3 ways, but that he succeeded. Jesus was able to do what you couldn't do. He lived the perfect life, and he went up on the cross and he died the perfect death, and his relationship in some ways was shattered so that when you look to him and receive Jesus, you can embody the power of the gospel in Christ's likeness to bring healing and reconciliation and encouragement to one another. Friends, invest in one another and encourage, exhort each other, because then and only then will you not fall into the deceitfulness of sin. And there are so many things vying for the affections of your heart. As the French philosopher and mathematician once said, in the heart of man is a God-shaped void that only God can fill. And idolatry is essentially trying to find a God replacement. So you take the puzzle piece of power and you try to fit it into your heart, but it doesn't quite fit, but it satisfies temporarily. You try to take the puzzle piece of success, puzzle piece of sex, puzzle piece of love, puzzle piece of family, puzzle piece of money. And you take all these puzzle pieces and one by one you try to fit it into your heart, and it satisfies a little bit. You hammer it in, you cut out the corners, so it satisfies a little bit, but it's only temporary. It'll run you into the ground because that's what the Bible calls sin and idolatry. Because Pascal was right. We were created the image of God, so that in the heart of man is a God-shaped void that only God can fill. And why the brilliant theologian Augustine has said in his book Confessions, my heart can only be satisfied in thy very own love. And my heart is restless until it finds its rest in God.